John David Kennedy's life was defined by Canada's infamous Kingston Penitentiary in many ways. For starters, he was born there on July 16, 1888 in the West Gate House, which used to have apartments for some of the prison staff. His father was a messenger for the prison who worked there for over 50 years, and his mother even had a set of keys to the prison gate. Kennedy also had an uncle who worked for the prison for more than half a century as well. The young John Kennedy took on what could be called the family business, and he too became a prison messenger. Kennedy married and the couple settled into a small red house in Portsmouth, now a suburb of Kingston, where they would raise a son. They also had a daughter who died in infancy. Except for service overseas during the First World War, in the period from 1933 to 1939, when the family moved to Ottawa, so Kennedy could work with the RCMP, he would spend his whole life in Kingston, connected to Canada's largest and oldest prison. His duties as a messenger meant that he would drive the prison's mail into town, as well as staff or prisoners under escort. On the morning of April 26, 1948, Kennedy kissed his wife and set about his day's work. His first job would be to drive a female guard and a prisoner from the nearby women's penitentiary into town to buy the inmate some new clothes as she was set to be paroled. At about 9:30, he took one of the prison's dark green Chevrolet sedans and set out to the warden's house across the road. On his drive up to the north gate, he passed by prisoner Austin Kraft in the yard, who was performing one of his duties of collecting some of the prison's garbage and hauling it to the front. Kraft was a career criminal who had spent most of his adult life being in and out of prison. At the time, he was serving a 10-year sentence for armed robbery. Kennedy stopped and offered to give Kraft a ride up to the front of the yard, something he had done many times before. In fact, Kennedy had helped to get Kraft a job in the yard. Kraft was not well liked even among his fellow inmates, and it was Kennedy who suggested to the warden that Kraft be given some light outdoor tasks to do to help make his time easier. Kennedy let Kraft out and proceeded through the first of the two gates of the prison's entrance. The two gates were opened and closed in sequence to maximize security and never allow a completely open exit. Just as the inner gate was closing, Kraft quickly ducked through and began brandishing a smuggled .32 Smith & Wesson revolver that he had hidden. This signaled his partner in the breakout, 21-year-old Howard Urquhart, to jump out of the car's trunk, where he had hidden himself when it was parked. Urquhart was serving a 20-year sentence for murdering a Toronto furrier. Kennedy ran for the alarm, but Kraft fired, the bullet passing through Kennedy's chest. He managed to crawl to a nearby storeroom, where he died. Kraft began firing at two gate guards and in the fray managed to get the outer gate open. Jumping into the car, now driven by Urquhart, the two sped out onto King Street. The escape was short-lived. The car was found damaged off the side of the road 3 hours later, just outside of Sydenham. The two escaped convicts were found lying in some bushes nearby, attempting to hide. Upon being discovered, they threw away the gun and shouted, "Don't shoot," before being arrested. Urquhart would be acquitted for his part in Kennedy's death, but received an extra 7 years on his sentence for the attempted escape. Kraft was sentenced to death and was hanged on January 24, 1949. No executions were ever carried out at Kingston Pen, despite it being the largest federal prison in the nation's history. Executions took place in provincial prisons, usually in a county seat. So Kraft was hanged at the Frontenac County Jail in Kingston, the last execution to take place in Frontenac. Kennedy was a very popular and well-liked man, and there was an outpouring of grief from the community. He was described by everyone who knew him as kind, gentle, and hardworking. A former neighbor of Kennedy said, "John Kennedy was as solid as they come. No one ever whispered a bad word about him." His wake at the small family home drew hundreds, and his funeral at St. Mary's Cathedral had thousands of mourners attend. It was one of the largest funerals in Kingston's history. The cortege took up 2 city blocks, and a line of cars a kilometer long followed behind the hearse. John Kennedy was the only person to have been born, to have worked, and to have died, all within the walls of Kingston Penitentiary.